hear me? Yes. If you can't, please just put your hand up. Right. I became a volunteer at Dunollie Castle. I can't actually remember how long ago. It was somewhere between 10 and 14 years ago when I retired, soon after I retired. I've been to a talk at the Cornhalls by Elaine, and I can't remember her second name, and I thought, oh, that's absolutely fascinating. And that took me up to find out about volunteering. And after, I think, the first year, I became an archive volunteer. I'm very much just an ordinary person. I have no particular qualifications. I'm not an academic, I'm not a historian, but I was very interested in the archive. I was particularly attracted to the process of deciphering Scottish secretary hand. So when the 1660s Rent book turned up, there was a great opportunity to practice because there were 126 pages. It took me about a year. I mean, obviously not working all the time at it, but yeah, it took a year. This talk is a joint effort because my dear friend here, Jamie McGregor, who's the Heritage Engagement Officer at Dunollie, said he would help, and without his help I don't think I'd have done it. Because this is his work. In 2022, the archive, the MacDougall Family Archive. The archive is in the 1745 part of Dunollie House, which is now the museum. The archive room is not open to the general public, though it's sometimes possible to arrange to see a particular document as part of a research project. Maybe one day, when development goes that way, it will be possible to take people into the archive, but not as it is at the moment. It's quite small and cramped. The documents in the archive came from various places in the house. The attics, trunks, boxes, just like this, drawers in various pieces of furniture, and they're the family archive going back about 5 centuries. One of the pieces of furniture in the main house that had been emptied some time before is a rather grand desk cum monuments chest. It's a lovely piece of furniture. And it was all empty except one drawer was locked and nobody had the key anymore. I mean, it obviously had been opened at some time. And the housekeeper asked her partner if he could come and have a look to see if it was possible to get in. And as you can see from the pictures, it obviously was possible. What he did was he took out the pigeonholes and went in from the top and managed to get it all back together again. Right. What they found in there was a large folder. I mean, it really was quite large, with very deep blue coloured pages, which I immediately thought, ooh, that's rather a strong colour of dye on those piece of paper to have documents in. However, the folder contained approximately 20 documents, mainly on vellum, which is perhaps why they didn't suffer being in there, mostly in Latin, and the oldest of which is dated 1450. They appear to be charters giving permission to own land and collect rents from tenants. Interestingly, there is an inventory dated 1720 listing most of these documents with a brief summary of what they're about. It was written in Inverary, presumably after the MacDougalls forfeited their lands due to taking part in the Jacobite uprising in 1715. These forfeited lands were then administered by the Campbells, the Duke of Argyll and his estate. The family did eventually get a proportion of the lands back that they had title to, a small proportion. Right, can we go back to, yes, the brown envelope, is there a picture?
That's
oh,
it.
Right, well, yes. Oh, right, because it doesn't look brown.
Yes, it's faded when it's come up.
This is just an ordinary brown envelope. And on, you can see this is Hope MacDougall's handwriting, in which she says, pretty interesting, amongst other things. Hope MacDougall, I'm sure you all know, but I'll just say this anyway, was the third daughter of Alexander, the 29th chief, and his wife Colina. She grew up with her two sisters at Dunollie, and Hope is well known for the very significant Hope MacDougall collection about Highland life, and her book about terror. Right, the rent book, when you first see it, looks like this. Not very impressive. It was in the brown envelope, by the way. It no longer has a cover, but as you can see from the binding, it was properly bound, so it must have had a cover to it at some point. It wouldn't have survived for 320 years if it hadn't had a cover. So I don't know when it lost its cover. The edges of the pages are ragged and to some extent worn away, as if it was repeatedly put into a pocket or various pockets over the years, maybe even damp pockets. The handwriting in the notebook is from various different hands, and I do have a few spare photocopies here that I bought, which actually show different people's handwriting. The entries date from 1655, the first entry that's dated. I mean, there are a few pages that aren't dated, but I think that's because they were part of a group of pages that were being entered at the same time, and whoever was doing the writing didn't put the date on every page in that particular group. As you would expect of a well-used 320-year-old, well-travelled notebook, there is quite a bit of staining and ingrained dirt, a little of which I have been able to clean off. However, there are parts where the writing is illegible. The worn edges and corners mean some of the words and numbers are missing, they're lost. The handwriting is called Scottish Secretary hand. This was the most used form of writing in the 1500s and the 1600s. A number of the letters were formed quite differently from today, and it was a joined up hand. If it hadn't been a joined up hand, it would be easier actually to transcribe, because each letter different people join their letters in different ways, and so not only do you have to decipher the letter, but you have to decipher the join bit. As today, each person's handwriting is different and particular to them. Some of the writing in the Wren book is quite clear, and some of it is not. Shortcuts and abbreviations were common, and of course spelling varied hugely. There are numerous words that I've been unsure about when transcribing, and probably I've made mistakes. A second or third look at a passage often resulted in coming up with a different conclusion. The 126 pages took a long time to transcribe, many hours looking through a magnifying glass to try and decipher and make sense of the words, with the idea that it should be decipherable to a reader 300 years later. That's not what they were doing. For example, there was no need for them, whoever, the scribe, whoever was actually doing the writing, there was no need for them to name the farms, because or say where the farms were. They named them, but they didn't say where they were. And sometimes it may just be a field that they're naming, and they don't say where it is because they knew that. They didn't need to write that down as well. That was just extra. Delightfully, on a few pages, there are little doodles, indicating perhaps an element of boredom whilst waiting to be given the next information to write down. I love that. Yeah. And look at the help sheet, which is what I made up for myself. And what I'm doing here is taking a letter and writing down all the various variations that I think I've found in various documents of that one letter, the different ways that people write it. And as you'll see, for instance, H is written very differently. E goes the other way. C is quite different. And that's not taking into account the variation in people's handwriting itself. Secretary hand was used throughout the book, except for a few very strange little additions in a much more modern italic sort of hand. The first of which says, an account of the sheep belonging to Lady MacDougall has, in 1713, 97 lambs. So I presume it's 90 sheep and 57 lambs. Oh, we're not on that one. Okay. Do we have that one?
No, just a
we don't. It's on the very first page, which I have here, you can see later. That particular conclusion. And the one I've just mentioned, must have been written a good 34 years after the book stopped being used. Because 1713, the last entry was, 1681 in the notebook. Another, on another page is written, come Holy Ghost eternal, God protecting from ... Mm-hmm. That's the top one. And another is, come Holy Ghost ever, on another page. And another is, in my beginning, God me speed in grace and what I think is virtue. Now it goes. And there's at least one of those little quotations or inclusions is actually written over an entry that was already there 34 years before, or how many ever years. The Lady MacDougall that I referred to at first was Mary MacDonald from Skye, and she was the wife of the 22nd chief, John MacDonald, known as the Inkeer. And they married in 1712, and the livestock mentioned could well have been her tocha, I think that's how you say it, or dowry. I have absolutely no explanation for these little curious additions. Maybe a young person needed to practice their handwriting and was directed towards this notebook, which was no longer in use, because they wouldn't have had pieces of paper lying around like we all do. Yeah, paper wasn't so plentiful. Now, the aspect of the rent book that I had most difficulty with was making sense of the random way that most of the entries were placed in the book. There was no attempt whatsoever at chronological order. For example, remember there was a total number of pages of 126. I'm going to mention page numbers, but there weren't any page numbers. I have used page numbers for my own, to make it clear where things were. So, date-wise, in 1655, there are entries on page 105 to 110. Those are the first entries. So here's the new book, not being opened at the beginning, open 20 pages from the end. Maybe they didn't see it as the end of the book. And that's where they started. And the last entries, the very last entry, one entry, last entry, by 26 years, this is 26 years later, in 1681, is on page 95. And the whole book's like that. I went through 1 year, it's actually in this folder, and just took the entries from 1 year, and they're just all the way through the book with no connection, between them. It's just, and it really puzzled me at first, and it still does actually. Right. There are a dozen or so blank pages in the book, again scattered through it, perhaps in groups of 2 or 3, and it does look as if some pages were very carefully cut out, leaving a little bit down the margin so its partner didn't fall out. Not every year has an entry. There are none at all for 1656. So the first entry was in 1655, no entries in 1656, no entries in 1657, but then in 1658 there are 18 pages of entries. These are mostly in pairs and again dotted about the book. The handwriting for that particular year, 1658, shows a number of different people making entries. The handwriting for the very first year is just one person making entries, and there are entries about Morven, Iona, Kerra and Ardmadi right at the beginning. In the 1600s, for about 10 years, the MacDougalls were collecting rents from Morven and Iona, and nearer to home, Kerra and round Dunollie, Dunollie Beg and Dunollie Mall. In 1290, the MacDougall lands included this area here. So that's Mull, Morven, Coll, Tiree, Jura, and North Kintyre, and the bits in between, which is a considerable area. But a lot of these lands were lost to the MacDougalls during the civil wars in the first half of the 17th century, I think, or perhaps before that. In 1661, there was a Scottish court case heard before the Scottish Parliament in which the MacDougalls of Dunollie and Rowray and Dunach and Degnish were compensated for their losses during the civil wars at the hands of the Marquess of Argyll. And in 1662, the Bishop of the Isles granted the MacDougalls of Dunollie the teens of Iona. Teens were tithes, which is not quite the same, I don't think, as rents, but I'm not sure about that. However, so that was 1662. However, in the rent book, there are counts of cows and horses and sheep on Iona as early as 1658, 4 years before they were granted these teens. 38 pages in the rent book were written contracts, what I call contracts, or agreements, is probably another term I should be using. And they vary in length. And they were worded quite formally, like legal documents. And most were at least witnessed, and it would say, witnessed by, and some of them, in fact, quite a number of them, were also signed by those witnesses. Some weren't signed, and some were signed. And these were usually 3 MacDougalls. These contracts are with named people, possibly related to the MacDougalls, who I assume, the named person, I assume, was the principal tenant or taxman of the particular land in question. This named person was agreeing, I think, to collect the rents and produce from the lesser tenants and cotters on that particular piece of land, and to pay the agreed amount set out in the contract. It was very much a financial agreement, these contracts. And it was either paid in money, and some of them said silver, some of the contracts said merks, some of the contracts said Scots pounds, plus a certain amount of butter, cheese, meal, livestock, and various other things which I'll come to later. One of the earliest contracts, dated the 8th of June 1658 again, was written at Funerary, which is in Morven, still called Funerary. And it was in favour of a Donald Cameron of LAHS. And I understand it to mean that Donald Cameron was to become the chief tenant or taxman of the 5-penny land of Mungerstill, also in Morven. 5-penny relating to the rent owable. A penny was also a measure of land. He would then have sublet smaller pieces of land to lesser tenants. And it goes on to say that Donald Cameron is to pay 250 merks. A merk was 13 shillings and 4pence in old Scots money, together with 10 stones of cheese and 10 quarts of butter. Also, a stone of cheese and a quart of butter and a wedder sheep to be presented at Christmas. It actually says as a present at Christmas, which we understand that quite differently now, obviously, when you say a present at Christmas, to what it actually meant here. It doesn't mean it's meant to be, I presume, presented at Christmas. I understand that there was much feasting and hospitality undertaken traditionally by clan chiefs at Christmas and maybe Easter too. So presents at Christmas comes up quite often in these contracts. I presume this produce was to be collected by the said Donald Cameron from all the lesser tenants and cotters, to have it ready either for collection or to actually take it or arrange delivery to the chief, I imagine. It doesn't actually say that. This particular document was witnessed by a Hugh MacDougall and an Alan MacDougall of Torsay, who became the 21st chief in 1686. This contract was witnessed but not signed. Most of the longer, later contracts are signed as well, more often than not by John MacDougall, the 19th chief, Duncan MacDougall, who became the 20th chief in 1669, and Hugh MacDougall, Duncan's uncle. It seems to indicate to me, and I might just be imagining things here, that this indicates that they travelled together, because the contract I first talked about was definitely dated as being written down in funerary, and all the contracts it says where they apply to. Most of the long contracts give an entry date at Martinmas, which is November the 11th, or Beltane, which is the 3rd of May, or St. Brandon's Day, which is the 16th of May, with a removal day, and this is another puzzle for me, with a removal day a year later. Surely they can't be expected to move out just after 1 year. I don't think it does actually mean that, but I need somebody who's got more expertise than me to explain it. There are some contracts recorded as having been renewed the following year, but only a few. And there are a few contracts that are for 3 years, but that's the longest that I came across. The rent book must have been incredibly valuable if it was the only record of these transactions, these contracts, these agreements. Some of the contracts included special or extra conditions. For example, I'm not exactly sure where on the Ross of Mull our ton is, but somewhere down this end, and there's Dunollie up there. Okay, so have that in mind. And no outboard engines were available. It's either sail or row. So this special extra condition to Charles MacLean in Artun, the Greens, which is a sort of grassy grazing area, I think. The Greens, called Grena Mackany. Charles is obliged to do all duty and service that the said John MacDougall, the chief, will require of him in sending a boat to Lorn. Well, that's a considerable distance at that time. However, presumably it was taken on. Another contract mentions the requirement to manure the land, another to actually build a byre with a specified number of couples rafters. There are other differences too. In some, the rent includes peats, eggs, bare barley, oats, or aquavita, which I presume is whiskey. Because spelling wasn't standardised until the mid-1700s, there are lots of variations. Right. Sheep, for example, was sometimes spelled S-C-H-E-I-P, and at other times S-H-W-P. Cow was sometimes spelled K-Y-E, K-O-W-E, K-O-W. It does seem likely that the scribe, the person doing the writing in the rent book, were Gaelic speakers, because their tenants would have all been Gaelic speakers. But everything in the rent book is in English, apart from place names, which are just the right. And the place names, yes, I'll come back to those. So Gaelic was predominantly a spoken language rather than a written language. Place names were probably not often written down. They didn't have road signs like we have everywhere. And for this is where there is most variation in spelling. Sometimes it's on the same page, the same, well, I assume it's the same place, has different spellings. And it's hard to know if the new name is a new place, or the new spelling is of a new place, or the same place that's already been mentioned. And I'm using this example at the top. Now my pronunciation is probably not the greatest. Achensul, Ochnasol, Achnashal, or Achinashal. And I think that might all be the same place, yeah. But I don't know how I can find that out. I've listed all the place names that occur in the book and have tried to identify them, not with complete success, but the areas covered do include Kerrera, Morven, Iona, part of the Ross of Mull. Ling, Seal and Kilnimber are briefly mentioned. Then there's Dunollie, Dunollie Beg, Dunollie Moor. Dunollie in the rent book is spelled Dunollie, which is rather nice, I thought. The same variation of spelling occurs with people's names. For example, second one down, McKeon. I think that's all McKeon. In Gaelic, they often use a reference to a descendant. Now, I'm on slightly shaky ground here because I think there are people here who know more about this than I do. However, I will continue. For example, in Gaelic, they often use a reference to a descendant as part of the name, and this is denoted with MHIC or MC or VC. For example, a tenant of Iona, Angus McEwen Vic VC Leicester. So Angus McEwen, descendant of Leicester, I think is what it means. Oig, I'm told, can mean either young man or deceased. So John Oig McDonaghy, Vic Ian Oig, could be young John McDonaghy, descendant of Ian, deceased. Women have the word Neen after the first name, as in Efric, Neen, Ian, Vic, Lachlan. later. The bulk of the entries, 60 pages, which is what, good half, are lists of the tenants with their rent, with the rent of their land and accounts, or accounts of their animals, sheep, cows and horses. The list to record payment of rent have a number, is done with a number of bolls or furlongs. A boll was 140 pounds of meal. A furlot was a fourth of a boll, a quarter of a boll. A boll was also used as a valuation of land. According to the number of bolls a tenant's land could be expected, presumably in a good year, could be expected to produce. This is quite complicated, this determined the set or the terms of the lease or rent. A tenant on Iona could be paying 2 bolls, that's 280 pounds of meal. This, to me, but I'm not a farmer, that sounds a lot to me, 280 pounds of meal to produce, plus you have to produce enough for your family, plus you have to perhaps produce feed for your animals, not sure what the fuck, apart from grass. However, Iona is a fertile island and they did practice manuring, so perhaps it was quite productive and it wasn't too difficult to raise the rent and sustain their own families and animals. I think all this information must have been collected on location as they went round. They couldn't possibly have collected all this information about the various animals from a distance. No phones. Some tenants shared animals, especially a horse, and there's even a record of a tenant having a quarter share of a horse. And there are quite a few records of a tenant having a half share of a cow. The age of sheep and cows and whether they were pregnant, with lamb or calf, castrated or barren, was all noted down. All this information. A not inconsiderable number of tenants, and this especially includes women, had only 1 cow and maybe a sheep, maybe 2 sheep, maybe not. Whereas other tenants might have 8 cows, 10 cows. It was important to know the numbers so that the grazings did not get overstocked. That would be to the detriment of the tenants and the land. This was called, I think, the Soom. In June 1668, there is an Iona count of keen sheep. This is on 1 page. You got it? No. No, okay, not yet. Okay. Keen meant payment in kind. There are 42 tenants listed in this particular list, and the total number of keen sheep is over 400. This is just Iona. Maybe not all these sheep are for payment of rent and are just potentially keen sheep. There are no clues as to what actually happened to these sheep. They didn't get driven with a drover like cattle did, I don't think. They had to be taken over water. When a sheep is mentioned in a contract to be given at Christmas, it's only ever 1 or 2. And they wouldn't present such a problem in delivery, so I'm not sure. There are 3 years when the counting of livestock, cows and horses and sheep on Iona is very thorough. 60, 68, 60, 69 and 70. The number of tenants stays fairly constant. Between 20 and 30. And the total number of cows plus horses listed for these years is between 140 and 179, which, when you think of how basically small Iona is, that sounds like a huge number to me, but of grazing animals, plus sheep, plus having to grow crops. The Highland pony and the black Highland cattle were both thick-coated, allowing them to be kept outside all year. Black cattle were able to graze and sustain themselves on even poor pasture. It's possible they were moved to grazings on the Ross of Mull or some of the other smaller islands. I think they did use them. In 1668, 69 and 70, the majority of tenants listed as having sheep were women. And I wonder if... Went down. Yes, well, women. And I did wonder whether this was because it was the women who did the spinning and weaving. Some of the farming terms used in the rent book, I'm kind of just picking up little items that struck me about the rent book. Some of the farming terms used in the rent book are still in use today. For example, Jamie tells me a yell sheep, today it's yelled, is a sheep not bearing young because of age or accident. And the word wedder is still used for a castrated male. This word features in some of the contracts. A wedder has to be presented at Christmas or Easter as part of the rent, which I mentioned already. In other words in use were tidy cow, which meant a cow was either with calf or giving milk. And farrow was a cow not in calf or past the age of having a calf. And great was used to describe a pregnant animal. Coy was used to denote a female animal. So a coy stirk was a heifer, and a stirk on its own was a young bullock. Right, something that took me by surprise. Of the 29 women sheep owners on Iona, 14 were named Catherine. And that, I thought, well, I used to be a teacher and you would have about 30 children in your class. Imagine 14 of them all with the same name. Mind you, these Catherines won't be the same age, but nevertheless. There were also 5 called Mary, 2 were Florence, 3 were Efric, and 3 were Margaret. So just the 5 names out of for the 29 women noted in the rent book, and were other women, I'm sure. Extra Gallic words, as I mentioned, were added to female names, which must certainly have helped to differentiate the various Catherines, as you can see here. For example, Catherine, Neen, Ian, Vic, Dean. I won't go through them. I apologise for my Gaelic pronunciation. Right, it was customary in the Highlands for cattle to be actually collected and sent to market with a drover. there are numerous drove roads. There's one just goes up behind my house. But surprisingly, only one page in the whole book of 21 years, there's only one page that is about collecting cattle together for the drover. In this case, it was from Iona. It's not dated, but an educated guess from me would be 1668. And at the top it says, the number of cows to be taken up from the tenants of Archaeological for the pound money counted, and I put it on in there. Pound money counted on the 12th of February and to be delivered to the merchant on the 1st of May, or 8 days before, or 8 days after. So they're giving 16 days leeway for the actual delivery. But that's 3 months. I mean, did it take 3 months to get cattle from Iona to, say, Falkirk? Presumably it did. Yeah. The total number of animals on this particular list was 49, which is a fair number to be in charge of. And of course these cattle represented money and livelihoods for the actual people on the island. Now there are a few one-offs in the rent book, as it was also used to record other sorts of transactions. And the first one that stood out for me is a marriage contract in 1658. It's all about the financial arrangement between Paul Weaver in Funerary, the woman's father, and the groom, Dougal Roy McKenrelch. The woman herself is not named, just referred to as Paul's lawful daughter. The agreed tocha, or dowry, is 100 merks, or if Paul doesn't pay it all in one go and splits it into 2 or 3 payments, it becomes 60, 120 merks. So that's quite a lot of interest. Both parties have to promise not to fail in their promises, nor to marry anyone else. And it's signed and witnessed by D. McDougall, J. McDougall and Hugh McDougall. An important document. Now there is a Paul Webster of Funerary mentioned in another place in the rent book. So I'm wondering if this is the same Paul who happens to be a weaver, and the marriage contract doesn't actually mention his surname, Webster, but I don't know. Another interesting anomaly is a shopping list. The items listed were bought from a travelling peddler, or packman, who would have had a pony or ponies, and it's known that they carried soft goods and also pots and pans. I think that soft goods were mostly those items needed for the making of clothes, as you will see from the list. The packman was known to be a very welcome visitor in the Highlands and Islands, for he could provide a great deal of news and gossip about neighbours and beyond. So the list says linen cloth for shirts, 1 pair of courtefans. Not sure what courtefans are, but the word cordovan is a type of Spanish horse leather. So I think they're maybe boots. Red fabric, 1 pair of white chicerons, Now, I've talked to a number of people about what chicherons might be, white chicherons, and it's a pair. Catherine Gillis came up with the idea that it would, they're stockings, white stockings, because they used to apparently wear white stockings. 3 hanks of white thread, red ribbons, coloured thread, and this is quite an interesting one, red silk, 2 dropes. When I looked at what a drope was, it's 1/16 of an ounce, which is a very small amount. So I thought maybe it's the thread needed to sew the red material. But I don't know. And lastly, buckram. Now buckram, the word buckram is still in use today, and it's the same thing. It's stiffening, usually maybe an inch wide, for putting in belts of skirts and trousers. My mother was a seamstress, and she used buckram. And lastly on the list was 1 white handled knife. Another list, and this one's not dated, furnishings sent to Dempster. 2 white plaids, 3 candlesticks, 1 bowster, which I think might be a bolster or a pillow, 8 pewter plates, 12 trusselers, and Linda Fryer thought that that might be a trencher, 12 trenchers which were wooden platters, and a spit. Now there are 2 kinds of spits. There was a roasting spit and a spit for hanging wicks when making candles. I don't know which one. And a lantern. An interesting note is that Dempster was an officer of the court who pronounced doom or sentence according to, directed by the clerk or the judge. That's from Scott's Dictionary. Dempster is actually a local name here. We had a family living in Glenlowland, Dempsters. There's Dempsters in Dunbeg. I think there's Dempsters in Lochgilphead.
And there were Dempsters in Morven.
Dunollie.
Yeah,
Yes.
there were Dempsters in Morven too.
Yeah.
Shepherd family in Glenlowland. Bill Shepherd's in Glenlowland. Yes.
I can't hear you, I'm sorry.
Yes.
Now 6 pages were loose, had become detached from the book. 4 of which have a chunk missing down one side, like that. And this one, is it this one, Julie? Yes, it is.
Yeah.
This one is a poem or a song. So the right-hand margin is intact, and each pair of lines ends in a rhyming word. And I'm just going to read a few of the lines. What horrid crimes defames these dismal days? What storms, confusions, changes now a phrase to model church and state and window all, to revile the fancies of the lower hall. That's the first 4 lines. And the last 4 lines are, because there's nothing missing from these, the harmless lambs exposed to the will of Lebanon's wolves, whose mirthless throats disdains to glut war's blood, then runneth in the names of noblest, brings forenamed for ancient glories. I'm sure I've read that dreadfully, but anyway, that's what it says. And we've puzzled over it, haven't we, Jamie? I did wonder if horrid crimes was a reference to 1647 when Guyland Castle was sieged and burned. And also there was a dreadful massacre that year at Dunavity Castle near Campbelltown, and a great many MacDougalls died. Jamie thinks it could be a reference to the killing times, which were a spillover from the Scottish Civil War. Right, we're nearly there. On Kerra, all the tenants, cotters and workmen appear to deal directly with the chief, not through a taxman or sort of chief tenant. And the portions of land written in these contracts for Kerra were much smaller. For example, Dougal McBaron takes a half-quarter of the lands of Guylan, so an eighth of the lands of Guylan, for 40 merks money, together with the ordinary presents and causalities, as was before and wont, to be paid at Martinmas. Ewan McKeon Vic William takes half of the manured land of our chalk, which is the farm immediately opposite from me where I live, for the payment of £10 money and the whole cess, or half of our chalk. In 1658, John McConnell took out a 3-year lease, one of a few 3-year leases, for the mill, also the mill grazing and the mill house croft, and that was for £40 Scots per year. The rent also included a dozen fowls, a quart of butter, a furlot of bare barley, and a wedder. There are 2 mills, or there were 2 mills on Kerra, one at Slattery over the other side, and one at Guylan. It doesn't say which one. There are a few pages with references to Dunollie, Dunollie Beg and Dunollie Moor. In 1668, Dunollie itself appeared to have 9 tenants. Dunollie Moor had 11 tenants, and Dunollie Beg, which is still a farm, had 3 tenants. And there's a short note that Dunollie Beg pays 112 merks, 4 sheep, 4 keen wedders, and 2 quarts of butter as the yearly rent. Duncan MacDougall, the 20th chief, gave liberty to Duncan MacTaylor Moore to build himself a house at Dunollie Beg at his own expense, for which he was to be paid when he left. His yearly rent was a gallon of whiskey, plus the usual, according to the custom of the country, it says. Perhaps the usual was cheese and butter, doesn't say. So there is much interest in the rent book that I haven't figured out, mainly through a lack of knowledge on my part. A lot of the entries are puzzling, mainly because of what has been left out or is illegible. The worn edges and corners has meant some key words have been lost. But, as I've already mentioned, it wasn't written to be understood 300 years later. Disappointingly, there is almost no personal information about the tenants. No little side comments that give an insight into the relationship the chief had with individuals. The packman's list was perhaps the only personal entry, but of course it too was about money. And the marriage contract definitely was a financial arrangement. There are still things to be figured out and connections to be made. And to finish. During the first lockdown, I spent a certain amount of time watching a series called Outlander, a fantasy that was set in the early part in Scotland, set in Scotland in the early part of the 1700s. perhaps 30 or 40 years after the Wren book. And I was much taken with one particular picture. The clan chief's accountant cum banker, plus his head man and helpers, went out on an expedition to collect the rents. The accountant sits at a table outside, writing down the amounts and the items that each tenant is bringing towards his rent. And there on the table was the rent book. I cannot, of course, vouch for any historical accuracy, but for me it fitted with the picture that I have in my head of how this book was used. I'm sorry I haven't got the actual book. I'm not allowed to bring it out of Dunollie. It's a very precious item, and that's all.
Do we have any questions? Yes. Will you take questions?
Yes, but people will really have to speak up because I'm quite deaf.
Jennifer, that was really interesting. In particular, do you have any further information on the 3 Dunollie home farms? You know, the farm at Dunollie, Dunollie Beg and Dunollie Moor. And where was Dunollie Moor?
There'll be some details that I haven't mentioned. There's not a lot. Because it was right there on the doorstep, and there would have been much more familiarity with who people were and what they had, and etc. But you're welcome to come and see it.
Take you up on that.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes.
Regarding personal entries, have you got any diaries from back then? I would have expected those kinds of things being put down
Not
in
as far as I
diaries,
know,
but
no.
nothing of
No.
that sort of survives.
I mean, although I've worked in the archive for a long time, there's so many documents there that I can't be absolutely sure of. But that's pretty early stuff. I mean, most of what I look at is sort of 18th century these days. But it's possible to search if I put in a date. So if that's what you particularly want to know about, I could do that.
So impressive, thank you very much.
Yes, totally fascinating. From both being farming and local history, I would just spend hours and hours reading it. Curious about the sheep, but you don't have any mention of fibre or fleece. And you were saying that there was a lot of sheep seemed to be being given. Might that be their shorthand for the fibre? Because at that point, fibre was more important than meat. So whilst they're saying...
Right, so the sheep weren't actually
It wasn't the sheep. The sheep weren't moved. It was the yield,
Yes,
which was the yield at that time would have been fibre.
Yeah, not mentioned at
And
all.
because fibre's not mentioned, and that's...
No.
I've never heard of that
No.
at this time,
No.
that you wouldn't...
No,
So maybe it's the yield of the sheep that's
Yes,
being mentioned
yeah.
in their shorthand.
yeah, that's a good point. Good point. It does explain
Mm-hmm.
why there's no indication of the sheep being
Yep.
moved.
Yes, there's no indication of sheep, and nothing about fibre, which would be
Mhm.
absolutely unheard of,
Mhm. No.
because that's what was important at that point.
I mean, they had to make their own clothes,
Yeah.
so I mean, they obviously used the
But
fleeces.
they traded in it as well. I mean, in other places there are, they're trying to set up weaving. It was a currency.
Currency, yes.
Absolutely. And yet the 1 or 2 at Christmas, that would be live sheep for the feasting, for feeding.
Right, so that's why they're mentioned.
Mhm.
Right, yeah?
And that's presented, live beasts
Yes.
handed over as opposed to a yield.
Yeah. Yeah, good point.
Hmm.
Jennifer, can
Not
I
one
follow on from Jill? I'm interested in the transport burnt stuff, and presumably it isn't, live sheep. How was that all transported, for example, from the Ross of Mull
Boat.
to Dunollie?
Boat.
Must have been
Lots of boats.
Must have been boat, because
Yes.
boat was there.
Exercise, what to go there and to come back. And it also brings me to the fact that there was a rent table at Dunollie. Did people come to Dunollie?
Yes,
And
that's
they went there as well.
that is true. I always just assumed that would be the local,
Yeah.
Yeah,
the more
it
local
could be,
people.
but just wondering what transport.
Boat. Everything was boat here, and a lot of them. I mean, lots and lots and lots of
Was it
boats.
done annually, monthly?
Twice yearly.
There are lots more questions there.
Yes, yes.
Well, fleece would be probably as shorn, because otherwise it would deteriorate.
Yeah, because if you get all that amount of corn and
Yeah.
it's a lot of transport.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
And then equally, where is it stored when it came to Dunollie?
Mm-hmm.
I think it couldn't have consumed all the produce at the castle. I think some of
This
it was
this is
obviously
trade.
for market.
Yeah.
So that, to support the chief's lifestyle. if you
Yep.
like.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Some early forms of mills in each area. as
Yep.
well.
Sorry?
There'll be some early mills in each area, down in
That's right.
Essex,
Yes,
down
yes,
the Ross and that, they have
yeah.
their own mill and stuff.
Uh-huh.
and then
Yeah,
Mhm.
yeah, I mean, there were two on there. So,
Mm-hmm.
And then a lot was done, themselves. I
Mm-hmm.
suppose.
Yes.
Jennifer, it's amazing that a number of examples you gave of livestock, particularly sheep, the same names are used today that were used 400 years ago. Obviously, you referred to a yelled sheep being one that's not pregnant and aware, obviously castrated male, which was often used for feeding over the centuries. Did you ever come across the word grit in the reg book?
how would you spell that?
GRIT. Grit is a pregnant sheep, and that terminology is used today even in the sale rings when sheep are being sold that are pregnant.
Not that I've come across. I mean, I may have missed it.
I was just curious.
I
if
assumed
other
it
ones
meant
were there,
something. It was something else. My transcribing is definitely not
There's a reason why.
100% accurate.
There's a reason why, because it's May and it's the dates. If you think of the dates that they're being done, sheep won't be pregnant then. They won't have, the tups are just going in, or they'll have lambed. So the dates that you're talking about, the records being taken, will have been before the tups go in, or as the tups go in, and after they've lambed.
Yeah.
That's probably why you don't have that reference. It's times of the year. Oh. I could spend the next 20 years looking at this. One or two of the local names you had one possible, you got Culnacloich. We have Culnadalach at part of Achnacloich estate, and Bowl of Cregan. Of course, we got Cregan
Yes.
up our way, and that one first map suggested that parts of Ardhatton and Cairn might have been involved. But they'd been passed on by then, because they were
Yes,
Lough Nell by
yes.
then, but
So I'm not.
it depended on what the reference was, because you
Yes.
didn't have the reference of the context of what those were.
I can't remember
But yes, I mean that was, and certainly from all the Ardhatton names, when you were saying, are all those different names the same version of Achnasoil? Absolutely. I mean, yes, the ones I've got for mine, for Ardhatton, you've got 15 different variations of one place. What would be really interesting to compare with that is also the hearth tax records, which you say 16950s for here, and also the Blau map, because that can have quite interesting place names.
I'm not familiar with that.
The Blau map is again is 1650s, and so you've got it may not be detailed enough, but certainly for Ardhatton I've got quite a lot of places. Yep. It's
Even Roy's map of slightly later.
Yep. Yes, Roy map as well. But Blau has surprising amount of detail for here. I've got quite a lot of my names for our Hatton on Blau. So you might be surprised what you can pick up around that. And yeah, it's on the NLS website. It's beautiful.
You know there's different spellings of Archaeological. Is that Archaeological down in
Yeah.
Seal?
Yes.
It is,
Yeah.
That was a mill.
Yeah.
Yeah, just as you're.
Aye.
Yes, just go over the bridge.
Yes.
Yeah, at Ardmaddy.
Just,
Yeah, because they had Ardmaddy estate,
yeah.
so the Ardmaddy land. So yeah. Yes, I mean I think you could bring it. We could have an open session for a whole day, and we'd all spend. We would all thoroughly enjoy adding information to that because it was just fascinating. Is there any likelihood of it going online? What you've got so far, in that yes, it will always be updated and get
It'll
more
have to
accurate.
be somebody else who does it.
Yeah.
I do have some spare photocopies of pages if you want